The days that followed were long and grueling for James. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers, only to be told that challenging the HOA would be an uphill battle. The legal fees alone were enough to make him hesitate. His frustration grew with each passing day, but he refused to give up. Something inside him, a stubborn streak he hadn't tapped into in years, kept pushing him forward. Still, the lack of support from his neighbors left him feeling isolated. It was as if the entire world had turned its back on him. One afternoon, desperate for a break from the chaos, James decided to visit a local cafe he frequented. It was a cozy little spot tucked away on a quiet street, known for its strong coffee and warm atmosphere. He ordered his usual, a double espresso, and sat at a corner table, staring out the window while sipping slowly. His mind was elsewhere, replaying conversations with Margaret and imagining ways to fight back. Just as he was about to leave, an older man approached his table. Dressed in a neatly pressed suit, the man carried an air of authority and wisdom. His silver hair and kind eyes made him seem approachable, yet there was something unmistakably commanding about his presence. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked, gesturing toward the empty chair across from James. James hesitated for a moment but nodded politely. "Sure, go ahead." The man introduced himself as Walter. "I couldn't help but notice you looked deep in thought," Walter said with a gentle smile. "Care to share what's bothering you?" At first, James wasn't sure how much he wanted to reveal. Strangers asking personal questions usually made him uncomfortable, but something about Walter's demeanor put him at ease. Maybe it was the genuine curiosity in his voice or the way he leaned in slightly, signaling that he truly cared. Whatever it was, James found himself opening up. "I'm dealing with this ridiculous situation involving my homeowners association," James began, shaking his head. "They've blocked my driveway with these massive cargo containers claiming it's for community safety. It's insane." Walter raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Cargo containers? That does sound extreme." "It is," James exclaimed, his voice rising slightly. "And when I tried to push back, they acted like I was the one being unreasonable. They're hiding behind some vague clause in the HOA agreement, and no one seems to care, not even my neighbors." Walter listened intently, nodding occasionally. When James finished venting, Walter leaned back in his chair, studying him thoughtfully. After a brief pause, he asked, "You wouldn't happen to be that James Calloway, would you?" James frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "What James Calloway?" Walter chuckled softly. "The same James Calloway who was recently appointed interim governor of the state?" For a moment, James just stared at him, stunned. Then he laughed nervously, waving off the suggestion. No, you must have me confused with someone else. I'm just a regular guy trying to deal with a messed up HOA." But Walter didn't laugh. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. He slid it across the table toward James. The headline read, "James Calloway sworn in as interim governor amid political shakeup." James's heart skipped a beat. He picked up the clipping, scanning the article quickly. Sure enough, it was about him. A few weeks earlier, he had been quietly sworn in as interim governor after a series of unexpected resignations within the state government. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. He saw it as a temporary role, something he could handle without disrupting his normal life. He had deliberately kept it low-key, avoiding media attention and continuing his routine as if nothing had changed. Now, staring at the evidence in front of him, James realized how significant his position truly was. And more importantly, he understood why Walter was bringing it up. "You see," Walter continued, "you're not just any homeowner fighting against an HOA. You're the governor. That changes things quite a bit, doesn't it?" James set the clipping down, his mind racing. He hadn't considered using his new title to address the situation. To him, being governor was a distant responsibility, separate from his personal life. But Walter was right. This changed everything. "What should I do?" James asked, looking at Walter for guidance. Walter smiled knowingly. "That's entirely up to you. But let me ask you this. Do you believe in justice?" Do you think people deserve fair treatment, regardless of who they are or where they live? Of course, James replied without hesitation. Then use your position wisely, Walter advised. Stand up for yourself not just because it's your right, but because others need to see that standing up to injustice is possible. If you don't, who will? The words hit James like a lightning bolt. For so long he had felt powerless, trapped in a system that seemed designed to crush individual voices. But now, he realized he had the tools to fight back, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever felt silenced by bureaucracy. Over the next few days, James immersed himself in research, learning everything he could about his rights as both a homeowner and a public official. He reached out to trusted advisors, including Walter, who proved to be an invaluable mentor. Together, they crafted a plan to confront the HOA head-on. James knew he couldn't simply march into the HOA, office and demand answers. That would come off as arrogant and entitled. Instead, he decided to take a more strategic approach. He scheduled an emergency meeting with the HOA board, ensuring that reporters from local news outlets were invited to attend. Transparency, he believed, would be key to holding the HOA accountable. The day of the meeting approached, James felt a mix of nerves and determination. He rehearsed his arguments, anticipating every counterpoint Margaret might throw at him. He also prepared documentation, proving that the HOA's actions violated state laws regarding property rights. Armed with facts and fueled by purpose, James was ready to face whatever came his way. On the morning of the meeting, James dressed in a sharp suit, projecting confidence despite the storm brewing inside him. As he walked into the conference room, he noticed the shift in energy immediately. The board members, who had always treated him with dismissive indifference, now looked uneasy. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others whispered nervously, among themselves. Margaret, seated at the head of the table, greeted him with forced politeness. "Mr. Calloway, thank you for joining us today," she said, her tone clipped. James nodded curtly, taking his seat. Before she could say anything further, he launched into his prepared remarks, speaking clearly and firmly. "I'm here today to address the unacceptable actions taken by this board against me and, by extension, other homeowners in our community. Blocking my driveway with military-grade cargo containers is not only unlawful, but also an egregious violation of basic property rights." The room fell silent. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, capturing every word. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but James cut her off, presenting his evidence piece by piece. He cited specific sections of state law that the HOA had violated, leaving no room for debate. By the time he finished, the board members looked visibly shaken. Margaret attempted to defend the HOA's decision, but her argument sounded hollow compared to James's well-researched case. Finally, she resorted to pleading ignorance, claiming she had acted in good faith based on advice from legal counsel. James didn't buy it for a second. When the meeting concluded, the outcome was clear. The HOA had no choice but to remove the cargo containers immediately. More importantly, the incident had sparked a larger conversation about the balance of power between homeowners and governing bodies. James had ignited a movement, and he knew this was only the beginning. Driving home that evening, James felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Little did he know, the real work was just beginning. James Calloway lived a simple, predictable life in a quiet suburban neighborhood. His days followed a rhythm he cherished: early morning jogs, coffee on his porch, and evenings tending to his garden. The house he owned wasn't extravagant, but it was his sanctuary, the place where he felt most at peace. It had taken years of hard work and sacrifice to buy it, and every corner of the property held memories. But one crisp autumn evening, that sense of peace was shattered. James returned home from work later than usual that day. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink as he drove through the winding streets of his neighborhood. He turned into his driveway, humming along to the radio only to slam on the brakes so suddenly that the tires screeched. His heart sank. There, blocking his driveway entirely, were 4 enormous military-grade cargo containers. They stood side by side like steel sentinels, their cold, unyielding surfaces gleaming under the fading light. For a moment, James just sat there staring blankly at the absurd sight before him. He blinked several times, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. But no, they were real, solid, imposing. Each container was roughly the size of a small truck, and together, they formed an impenetrable wall across his driveway. How could something like this happen? Who would do such a thing? And why? Fuming, James stepped out of his car, slamming the door harder than he intended. He circled the containers, inspecting them closely. There were no markings or signs indicating who had placed them there or why. No notes, no explanations, just sheer audacity. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The containers weren't just inconvenient. They rendered his driveway completely unusable. His car was effectively trapped outside the road, and getting into his garage seemed impossible now. His first instinct was to call someone, anyone, who might have answers. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number for the Homeowners Association, HOA, which governed the community. After a few rings, Margaret Hensley, the HOA president, picked up. James launched into an explanation of the bizarre situation, his voice rising with each word. "Margaret, there are 4 massive cargo containers blocking my driveway," he exclaimed. "I can't even get into my house properly." To his astonishment, Margaret didn't sound surprised, or even concerned. Instead, her tone was calm, almost smug. "Yes, Mr. Calloway," she said smoothly. "We're aware of the situation." "Aware?" James echoed, incredulous. "You put those things there?" "We did," Margaret confirmed without hesitation. "It's part of our new initiative to ensure community safety and maintain property uniformity." "Safety?" James sputtered. "How does blocking my driveway make anything safer?" "It's all outlined in the HOA agreement," Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "These measures are necessary to protect the integrity of the neighborhood. You signed the document when you moved in, remember?" James clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling over. He vaguely recalled signing stacks of papers when he purchased the house, but he certainly didn't recall agreeing to let giant metal boxes take over his driveway. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You can't just block someone's driveway because of some vague clause in a contract." "I'm sorry you feel that way," Margaret said coolly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But rules are rules, Mr. Calloway. If you have an issue, I suggest you review the HOA guidelines carefully." Before James could respond, Margaret hung up, leaving him seething. He stared at his phone, then back at the monstrous containers looming in front of him. How could this be happening? This wasn't just inconvenient. It was an outright violation of his rights. His driveway was his property, wasn't it? Surely there had to be laws protecting homeowners from this kind of nonsense. Over the next hour, James paced back and forth trying to think of solutions. He considered calling a lawyer but realized he didn't know any personally. He thought about dragging the containers away himself, but they were far too heavy for one person to move. Frustrated and exhausted, he finally gave up and parked his car on the street, trudging into his house through the front door. The next morning, James woke up determined to fight back. He started by reviewing the HOA agreement, poring over page after page of dense legal jargon. To his dismay, Margaret was right. There was indeed a clause buried deep within the document that allowed the HOA to implement necessary measures for the sake of community safety. The language was vague enough to cover almost anything, giving the HOA broad authority over residents' properties. Feeling defeated, James decided to talk to his neighbors, hoping to find allies. Surely others must have been outraged by the HOA's actions. As he knocked on doors throughout the day, however, he quickly discovered that most people were either unaware of the situation or too afraid to speak out. Those who did know about the containers shrugged it off, saying things like, "It's not my problem," or "The HOA knows best." A few even sided with Margaret, claiming that James was making a fuss over nothing. By the end of the day, James felt more isolated than ever. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, and he began to question whether fighting back was worth it. Maybe he should just give in. accept the absurdity of the situation and move on. But deep down, something inside him refused to surrender. This wasn't just about his driveway anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. If he didn't push back, who would? That night, as James lay awake in bed, he replayed the events of the past 24 hours in his mind. The injustice of it all gnawed at him. He thought about how powerless he felt against the HOA's authority, how dismissive Margaret had been during their conversation. For the first time in years, James felt truly angry, not just at the HOA, but at the system that allowed such blatant overreach to go unchecked. Little did he know, fate had other plans. In the coming days, James would uncover a secret that would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. But for now, all he could do was wait, plan, and prepare for the battle ahead. The days following the HOA meeting brought a wave of change that rippled through James's neighborhood and beyond. The once oppressive atmosphere dissolved, replaced by a sense of empowerment and unity among residents. People who had previously kept to themselves now exchanged smiles and greetings on morning walks. Neighbors began organizing community events, from weekend cleanups to potluck dinners, fostering connections that had long been absent. For James, this transformation was both heartwarming and humbling. He hadn't set out to become a hero, but his actions had sparked something far greater than he could have imagined. Word of James's stand against the HOA spread quickly, thanks in part to the media coverage of the emergency meeting. Local news outlets ran stories highlighting his courage and determination, framing him not just as a homeowner fighting for his rights, but as a symbol of resistance against unjust authority. One headline read, "Governor-turned-activist takes on HOA overreach." Another proclaimed, "How one man's fight inspired a community." These articles painted James as a champion for ordinary people, someone who refused to back down when faced with unfair treatment. But James wasn't interested in fame or accolades. What mattered most to him was ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had gone through. He knew all too well how intimidating it could be to challenge powerful entities like HOAs, especially when you felt alone. That's why he decided to take his advocacy statewide, using his position as governor to push for meaningful reforms. James began by drafting legislation aimed at holding HOAs accountable for their actions. The proposed bill included measures such as stricter oversight of HOA decisions, mandatory transparency in financial dealings, and protections for homeowners against arbitrary fines or penalties. It also required HOAs to provide clear explanations for any rules they enforced, along with avenues for appeal if residents disagreed. To gather input for the bill, James organized a series of town hall meetings across the state. Each event drew crowds of concerned citizens eager to share their experiences. Some spoke about exorbitant fees imposed for minor infractions, like planting flowers in the wrong color scheme. Others recounted tales of being banned from attending HOA meetings after speaking out against board members. A few even broke down in tears, describing how relentless harassment had forced them to sell their homes. Listening to these stories reinforced James's resolve. Every word spoken, every tear shed, reminded him why this fight was so important. After each meeting, he stayed late to speak with attendees individually, offering advice and promising to do everything in his power to help. His sincerity won over skeptics and inspired hope in those who had lost faith in the system. One particularly memorable town hall took place in a small rural town about 2 hours outside the city. The room was packed, with people spilling into the hallway. An older man named Harold stood up during the Q&A session, clutching a worn folder filled with papers. His hands trembled as he began to speak. "I've lived in my house for 30 years, Harold said, his voice cracking. "It's where I raised my kids, where we celebrated birthdays and holidays. But last year the HOA fined me $500 because I didn't trim my hedges exactly to their specifications. When I couldn't pay, they put a lien on my property. Now I'm facing foreclosure, all because of some shrubs." The room fell silent as Harold finished, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. James nodded sympathetically, feeling a lump form in his own throat. "Thank you for sharing your story, Harold," he said gently. "What happened to you is unacceptable, and I promise you, we're going to fix it." After the meeting, James pulled Harold aside and helped him connect with legal resources. He also made sure Harold's case was included in the documentation supporting his proposed legislation. Stories like Harold's were powerful reminders of the human cost of unchecked power, and James was determined to ensure they wouldn't be ignored. As the weeks went by, James's efforts gained momentum. Support poured in from unexpected quarters, including local politicians, grassroots organizations, and even some former HOA board members who admitted they'd grown disillusioned with the system. One retired HOA president wrote James a heartfelt letter, apologizing for past mistakes and pledging to support his reform efforts. "I didn't realize how much harm we were causing until I saw things from the other side," she wrote. "You've opened my eyes." Not everyone was pleased with James's initiatives, however. Some HOA leaders lashed out, accusing him of demonizing their organizations and undermining their ability to maintain order. They argued that strict rules were necessary to preserve property values and protect communities. While James acknowledged the importance of maintaining standards, he countered that such goals shouldn't come at the expense of fairness and compassion. "It's not about eliminating rules," he explained during a televised interview. "It's about making sure those rules are reasonable, transparent, and applied equitably. Homeowners deserve respect, not intimidation." His message resonated widely, earning him widespread support. Polls showed that a majority of residents backed his proposed reforms, and petitions calling for legislative action garnered thousands of signatures. Even opponents of the bill struggled to argue against its core principles, which emphasized accountability and justice. Back in James's own neighborhood, the changes were palpable. The new HOA board worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with residents, hosting open forums and inviting feedback on policy decisions. They implemented a neighbor-first approach, prioritizing communication and collaboration over enforcement. For the first time in years, people felt heard and valued. James found himself reflecting often on how far they'd come. Just months earlier, he had been an ordinary homeowner battling an impossible situation. Now he was leading a movement that promised to reshape the way communities governed themselves. Yet despite the progress, he remained grounded, never losing sight of the lessons he'd learned along the way. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching fireflies dance in the twilight, James thought about the journey that had brought him here. He remembered the frustration and isolation he'd felt when the cargo containers first appeared, the disbelief upon learning of his appointment as governor, and the exhilaration of standing up to the HOA. Most of all, he thought about the countless individuals whose stories had fueled his determination to create change. Leadership, he realized, wasn't about wielding power. It was about using it wisely. It meant listening to others, amplifying their voices, and working together toward a common goal. James had discovered that true strength lay not in dominance, but in empathy and perseverance. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road ahead would still be challenging, full of obstacles and setbacks, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. Together, with the support of his community and the belief that justice always found a way to prevail, he was ready to face whatever came next. Months had passed since the dramatic showdown with the HOA, and James's neighborhood was almost unrecognizable. The once tense atmosphere had given way to a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now exchanging gardening tips over freshly brewed coffee. Kids played freely in the cul-de-sacs, their laughter echoing through the streets. Even the physical appearance of the community had improved. Flower beds blossomed along sidewalks, trees were trimmed neatly, and colorful banners hung from lampposts for upcoming block parties. For James, this transformation was deeply satisfying. It wasn't just about reclaiming his driveway or winning a legal battle. It was about restoring trust and fostering connections among people who had been divided by fear and frustration. He often caught himself marveling at how much had changed, not just in the neighborhood but within him as well. The reforms James championed statewide were also gaining traction. After months of tireless advocacy, his proposed legislation finally made its way to the state legislature. Lawmakers debated passionately, with some voicing concerns about potential pushback from powerful HOAs. but public support remained overwhelmingly in favor of the bill, buoyed by countless testimonies from homeowners who had suffered under oppressive governing bodies. When the vote came, the bill passed with a resounding majority, marking a historic victory for property rights and transparency. The new law mandated stricter oversight of HOAs, requiring them to operate with greater accountability and fairness. Homeowners gained clearer avenues to challenge unreasonable rules and penalties, while HOAs were obligated to provide detailed explanations for any decisions affecting residents. Perhaps most importantly, the legislation established an independent review board to mediate disputes between homeowners and HOAs, ensuring that neither side could abuse their power. News of the bill's passage spread quickly, drawing national attention. James became a symbol of grassroots activism, celebrated not only for his role in drafting the legislation, but also for inspiring others to take action. Invitations poured in, from talk shows eager to feature him as a guest, to community groups asking him to speak at their events. While he accepted some invitations, James remained focused on his primary mission: empowering ordinary people to stand up for themselves. One particularly memorable event took place in a bustling city auditorium, packed with hundreds of attendees. As James stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. He smiled warmly, raising a hand to acknowledge their enthusiasm before launching into his speech. "When I first stood up against my HOA," he began, "I never imagined it would lead to this moment. I was just a regular guy trying to protect what mattered most to me: my home, my family, my peace of mind. But somewhere along the way, I realized something important. None of us are truly alone in our struggles. Every person here has faced injustice, whether big or small, and every one of you has the power to fight back." His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement or wiped away tears. James went on to share practical advice for challenging unfair systems, emphasizing the importance of documentation, persistence, and solidarity. "You don't have to face these battles by yourself," he said firmly. "Find allies, speak up, stand together. That's how real change happens." After the event, dozens of people lined up to thank James personally. One young woman approached him clutching a notebook filled with questions about navigating a dispute with her own HOA. Another man handed him a letter detailing years of grievances, hoping James might offer guidance. Though exhausted, James stayed, late to listen to each story, offering encouragement and resources wherever possible. Back home, life settled into a rhythm of quiet contentment. James spent his mornings tending to his garden, savoring the simple joys of watching plants grow and bloom. In the afternoons, he often joined neighbors for walks around the block, chatting about everything from politics to weekend plans. Evenings were reserved for reflection, usually accompanied by a cup of tea and the soft glow of porch lights. Despite his busy schedule as governor, James prioritized staying connected to his roots. He attended neighborhood meetings regularly, listening to residents' concerns and celebrating their achievements. When someone suggested renaming the annual summer picnic Callaway Day in his honor, he laughed it off, insisting that the focus should remain on the community, not on him. Yet deep down, James knew he had grown in ways he never anticipated. The challenges he faced had taught him invaluable lessons about resilience, empathy, and leadership. He learned that standing up for oneself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. And he discovered that true strength lay not in dominating others but in lifting them up. One crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, James found himself sitting on his porch with Walter, the retired government official who had first encouraged him to embrace his role as governor. They sipped coffee and reminisced about the journey that had brought them here. "You've done incredible work," Walter said, raising his mug in a toast. "Not just with the HOA reforms, but with everything. You've reminded people that they have a voice and that it matters." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I didn't do it alone. None of this would have happened without folks like you believing in me, and without neighbors stepping up to support each other." Walter smiled knowingly. "That's exactly why you're so effective. You understand that leadership isn't about standing above others. It's about walking beside them. The comment struck a chord with James, encapsulating everything he had come to believe about the nature of power and responsibility. He gazed out at the quiet street, illuminated by the warm light spilling from windows. Children chased each other across lawns, their giggles mingling with the rustle of leaves. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked playfully and the faint hum of conversation drifted through the air. In that moment, James felt profoundly grateful, not just for the victories he had achieved, but for the journey itself. Life had thrown him challenges he couldn't have foreseen, but it had also given him opportunities to grow, connect, and make a difference. He thought about all the people he had met along the way, the neighbors who rallied behind him, the strangers who shared their stories, the critics who pushed him to think harder and dig deeper. Each interaction had shaped him in ways he was still discovering. He realized that justice wasn't a destination, it was a process, an ongoing effort to create a world where everyone felt seen, heard, and valued. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be filled with new obstacles, James felt ready to face them, one step at a time. As the night grew cooler, James wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and leaned back in his chair. Above him, stars twinkled brightly against the dark canvas of the sky. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace, not because every problem had been solved, but because he knew he was part of something bigger than himself. Together, with the support of his community and the belief that fairness always found a way to prevail, he was building a legacy rooted in hope, courage, and compassion, and that he decided was enough. The day of the emergency HOA meeting arrived, and James woke up with a mix of anticipation and nerves. He had spent the previous night reviewing his notes, rehearsing his arguments, and mentally preparing for every possible scenario. The stakes were high, not just for him but for everyone in the neighborhood who had ever felt powerless against the HOA's iron grip. This wasn't just about reclaiming his driveway anymore. It was about setting an example, proving that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged if someone was willing to stand up. James dressed carefully that morning, choosing a dark navy suit paired with a crisp white shirt. He wanted to project authority without appearing intimidating. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, he reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't about revenge or ego, it was about fairness. He took a deep breath, grabbed his folder of documents, and headed out the door. When James arrived at the community center where the meeting was being held, he noticed a small crowd gathering outside. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact with him now approached cautiously, some offering words of encouragement. "Good luck, James," one woman said softly. "We're all counting on you." Another man nodded firmly, adding, "You're doing the right thing." Their support bolstered his confidence as he walked into the room. Inside, reporters from local newspapers and TV stations were setting up cameras and microphones. The presence of the media added a layer of pressure, but James welcomed it. Transparency was key, and he knew the public deserved to know what had been happening behind closed doors in their community. The board members were already seated at a long table at the front of the room. Margaret Hensley sat at the center, her usual smug expression replaced by a look of unease. She glanced nervously at the reporters, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden spotlight. When James entered, all eyes turned to him. He strode confidently to the podium, placing his folder down before addressing the room. "Thank you all for coming today," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I'm here to discuss a matter that affects not only me, but also the principles of fairness and justice that should guide any governing body, including this one." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent except for the faint hum of camera shutters clicking. Then, he launched into his presentation, starting with the facts. Using slides projected onto a screen behind him, James outlined the sequence of events leading up to the placement of the cargo containers. He showed photographs of his blocked driveway, dated receipts proving he owned the property outright, and excerpts from state laws that protected homeowners' rights. "This isn't just about inconvenience," he emphasized, pointing to the screen. "It's about overreach. It's about using vague language in contracts to justify actions that violate basic property rights. And it's about accountability. As he spoke, the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret tried to interrupt several times, but James remained composed, deflecting her attempts with polite yet firm responses. "I'll address your concerns shortly, Margaret," he said at one point, maintaining control of the conversation. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with her growing agitation. Next, James presented evidence showing how the HOA's actions violated specific clauses in state law. He cited examples of similar cases where courts had ruled against HOAs for infringing on homeowners' rights. Each piece of information was delivered methodically, leaving no room for doubt. By the time he finished laying out his case, the board members looked visibly shaken. Margaret finally managed to speak, though her tone was defensive. "Mr. Calloway, I assure you that our intentions were never malicious. We were simply following guidelines intended to protect the community." James raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Protecting the community doesn't mean trampling on individual rights. If anything, your actions have created division and fear among residents. That's not leadership, that's abuse of power. His words struck a chord. Murmurs rippled through the audience as neighbors exchanged glances. Some nodded in agreement while others whispered to each other about their own grievances with the HOA. For years they had stayed silent, too afraid to challenge the board. But seeing James take a stand gave them courage. Realizing she was losing ground, Margaret attempted to shift the blame. "We consulted with legal counsel before making this decision," she insisted. "If there was a misstep, it wasn't ours. It was theirs." James didn't miss a beat. "Then perhaps it's time to reconsider who you're taking advice from," he replied smoothly. "Because ultimately the responsibility lies with you. You made the decision to block my driveway, and you must face the consequences." The final blow came when James revealed his trump card, a letter from the state attorney general's office supporting his claims. The document confirmed that the HOA's actions were indeed unlawful and warned of potential penalties if they failed to rectify the situation immediately. Gasps echoed through the room as the gravity of the situation sank in. By the end of the meeting, the outcome was undeniable. The HOA had no choice but to issue a formal apology and remove the cargo containers within 24 hours. Margaret resigned shortly thereafter, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth. Her reign of intimidation was over. As James left the community center, he was greeted by applause from the crowd. Neighbors patted him on the back, thanking him for standing up to the HOA. One elderly woman even hugged him, tears in her eyes. "You've given us hope," she said. "We thought we'd never see change." That evening, as James sat on his porch watching the sun set, he reflected on everything that had happened. The victory felt satisfying, but it wasn't the end of the road. In fact, it was only the beginning. He realized that the fight against injustice rarely ended with a single win. It required ongoing effort and vigilance. Over the next few weeks, James continued using his position as governor to advocate for reform. He proposed legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within HOAs statewide. Town hall meetings became lively forums where residents shared their stories and voiced their concerns. James listened intently, determined to create meaningful change. One evening, during a particularly emotional town hall, a young mother stood up to speak. Her voice trembled as she described how the HOA in her neighborhood had fined her repeatedly for minor infractions, driving her family into financial hardship. "We didn't know where to turn," she admitted, "but hearing about what you did gives us strength. Thank you for showing us that we don't have to accept unfair treatment." Her words resonated deeply with James. He smiled warmly, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Leadership, he realized, wasn't just about holding a title. It was about empowering others to believe in themselves and their ability to effect change. Back in his own neighborhood, things began to improve dramatically. With Margaret gone, the HOA restructured its policies, focusing on collaboration rather than control. Residents started working together to beautify common areas, organize community events, and foster a spirit of unity. The once divided neighborhood transformed into a close-knit community where people genuinely cared for one another. Through it all, James remained humble. He never sought recognition or praise, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. Yet, he couldn't deny the profound impact this experience had on him. It taught him the importance of perseverance, integrity, and standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As he sat on his porch that night sipping a cup of tea, James felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had thrown him a curveball, but instead of dodging it, he had swung hard and won. More importantly, he had inspired others to do the same. And in doing so, he had discovered a new chapter in his life, one filled with purpose, meaning, and the unwavering belief that justice always found a way to prevail.